I have another small 7 by 10 inch watercolor to share with you today. This is a painting of an olive-sided flycatcher. They aren't super common here in mid-Michigan, but they pop up occasionally in the spring and the fall. Every time I've gotten to see them in this area, they've been sitting high in bare trees. Prior to recording, I masked off the bird and branches with liquid frisket so I could wash in a soft, cloudy background. I also mixed up my background colors. I chose to do a wet-on-wet wash in order to have a very soft gradient. I pre-wet my paper with a 1-inch flat brush. Cold-pressed papers are way more forgiving for washes with more open time and less likelihood of back runs. For this painting, I'm using Arches 140-pound hot-press paper, which has a smooth surface for putting in detail, but is much more fussy about washes. Because of this, I spent a lot of time wetting and inspecting the paper before I started the wash. I watched the shininess of the page, looking to see that it wasn't drying out in some areas and puddling in others. Ideally, before laying in your wash, you want it perfectly evenly wet. If I see some areas starting to dry out, like these at the top of the page, I'll hit it with some more water and wait a bit. You don't have to be nearly as picky with cold-pressed paper, but the more evenly soaked the paper is, the more predictably your wash will take the page. Once I'm satisfied that everything is evenly wet, I tilt the page so gravity will help pull the paint down the page. If I'm going to have a gradient, I always keep the lightest values at the top and the darkest at the bottom, where they're going to be dragged by gravity. In this case, that meant flipping my page. Using a number 4 round brush, I started putting in my pinkish colors using quinacridone magenta and dioxazine purple. I streaked in my colors horizontally. As I moved down the page, I transitioned my colors to bring in more ultramarine blue. Hopefully these should look like stacks of distant blurry stratus clouds later on. For washes, you generally want to work pretty much in one direction, and that's down the page with gravity, and this keeps the paper evenly wet as the pigment grabs onto the page. I did return to a few areas in my wash, but the paper was still wet enough to get away with it. I was also using a dry number 6 round brush to suck off some of the puddling pigment and to remove a few hairs from our dog that magically appear every time I do a wash. Once the paper starts to get that dull sheen or satin appearance to it, you know that the paper's too dry to bring in more paint without the fear of back runs. You can see that at the top part of the page is already pretty dull, and it was almost dried out. At this point, I chose to hit everything with a hairdryer to lock in the paints. After looking at the background, I was pretty happy, but I thought it needed a little bit more blue at the top of the page. I inverted the paper again and brought in some more paint and softened the edges with water. With a little more color at the top, it looked better to my eye, so I stopped working on the background. I removed the frisket and then transferred my foreground details using a tracing paper transfer in a folding bone. Now I was ready to start on the bird and branches. My next task was to add some basic shading to the scene to establish the overall lighting. I did this using a number 2 round brush and a similar mix to my sky colors with ultramarine blue, quinacridone magenta, and dioxazine purple. With that done, I moved on to adding the lightest local colors for the foreground. In this case, the largest area was the branches, which were going to be covered with a patchwork of lichens and peeling bark. I chose to start with the light brown made of yellow ochre, sap green, and cadmium red for the centers of the branches. Next, I moved on to blocking in the lichen green areas using some sap green with a little chrome orange. All these early passes are really light, watery, and loose. Later, I'll glaze in successively darker colors as I work in the details. In trying to cover up the whites of the page, I started putting in some color on the bird with a grade green made of phthalo green, cadmium red, and dioxazine purple. For the head, I added a little burnt sienna to my green. Here in Michigan, many dead branches end up covered with 2 competing types of lichen. One's more yellow-green and the other more blue-gray. I started washing in a super light wash of phthalo blue to the remaining lichen-covered areas. With all the lightest colors in, I started the long process of glazing in many layers of pigment to get the color, contrast, and detail of the finished piece. I started with more of the branch browns, starting with some ultramarine blue, dioxazine purple, and burnt sienna. As I worked through, I started bringing in warm tones in some areas with quinacridone magenta and some permanent alizarin crimson. Those tones should work well with the pink-purple sky that's already in the background. After putting an additional color on the bird's head, I started back in on the branches. These will take up the majority of the time in the painting, and that's typically the case for my bird paintings. The backgrounds account for a lot more surface area than the birds. For the branches, I wasn't looking all that much at my reference photos. Typically, when I see this species, they're way up high in a dead treetop, inspecting the area for insects to eat and catching them in flight. Being so far away, my photos didn't have a lot of fine detail on things like the branches to follow, so I was going to fake a lot of it and suggest more than I was specifically rendering. I followed my overall lighting and shapes from the photos, but for the lichens and scaling bark, I was mostly faking in those small details. As I moved further into the painting, the glazes of color going in had less water and more pigment, gradually becoming more and more opaque. I blocked in some extra shadow areas to decide where my overall shapes were going to fall. In many ways, this approach with glazes is a refining process, almost like sculpting where you make rough choices first and slowly add more detail as you go. In moving away from my photo reference, I made a lot of choices which hopefully made the painting stronger than my camera work. First was substituting in a sky with some color and detail. White skies like the ones in my reference photo, they can work at times, but they can also be pretty boring. I chose to add the streaky clouds moving from light blue to a soft purple pink. Even if they're light and subtle, having these colors present invites me to introduce more colors to the shadows, and having some saturated colors in those areas always seems to make things more fun. Compositionally, I chose to add more branches into the frame. A lot of wildlife art becomes paintings of birds on a stick. Anymore, I try to add a lot of other elements to the frame to make things more interesting. Here I added branches to the background and to the right of the bird. I chose to have them kind of taper off in density as they move to the right of the page. There are tons of elements that determine how much complexity and energy your composition will have. And these include things like gradients in color or value, how you group objects in the frame, blurry versus focused detail, fully rendered or more suggested approaches. Here I was trying to have a relaxing composition, but one that had enough things to investigate and travel through that it was interesting to look at. By adding color, gradients, and additional branches, I thought it could really add a lot to the visual experience. At other times, you might be better off removing elements and complexity to make something better. It really depends on the scene that you're trying to render. As I glazed in detail, I was keeping a few things in mind. I wanted to bring in the right colors to describe things accurately, but I'm also concerned with having these colors work well together and give enough variety to make them interesting. Unifying colors in shadows and highlights tends to solve some of the problems with colors working together well. I tried to mix in some warmer highlights and cooler shadow colors to my lichens greens as well as the warmer browns of the bare sticks. That should help things work together as I move along. Another thing I was keeping in mind as I was painting was the final textures I was rendering. As I laid in the colors to the bumpy lichens and peeling bark, I was applying the paint in a kind of scribbly pattern. After many layers, that starts to build up a suggestion of texture. Later I can pick up on the inferred texture and add some more darks to render those into cracks or little bumps. As I was doing the brushwork for the uncovered sticks, I used longer brush strokes in the direction of the branch to show the grain of the wood. And once a bunch of these glazes go in, it starts to look a lot like wood. Following that same general idea, as I was rendering the textures of the bird, I used a lot of short brush strokes following the feather pattern. Again, as those build up and overlap, it starts to create a convincing texture of feathers. One thing I was consciously working toward was to having the level of detail and contrast varied. In my photo, everything was pretty much at an even level of focus. Unfortunately, sometimes when things are rendered with an even amount of detail and focus, they end up looking flat. Fortunately, there are a lot of cues that we observe and our brains interpret to tell us about the depth and dimensions of a scene. Some of these we can manipulate in paintings to add extra information, even if it isn't in our reference. Some depth cues aren't useful. A good example of this is that we humans are blessed with stereo vision, but that isn't useful to painters and 2D artists who are only making a single image. On the plus side, many depth cues are definitely at our disposal in most paintings. A simple example is overlapping. Here we have some branches traveling in front of others. That's pretty clearly establishing what's in front. I had a bunch of choices on how I could add more depth to the painting. Depth of field and blurring can be a great option and is one that I use a lot. Since I had a distant background with some cloud detail, I couldn't blur with distance and have it read correctly. I mean, come on, things don't start focused, blur, and then come back into focus for the clouds in the distance. That still left me with a few other choices. You'll often hear that light colors move forward and that dark colors recede. And that often works, but there are a lot of examples where that fails. What does consistently work is that areas of high contrast move forward and those of less contrast recede. This has been done for ages and is a great way to go in watercolor. I did that here. Although they are all rendered with sharp edges, the bird and the close branches have higher contrast, and the more distant ones a bit less. And the most distant ones have very little contrast. A neat depth cue that painters can do that photography can't is using a lack of detail rather than a lack of focus. And this can really look great and has a more painterly feel. I did this for the more distant branches, which received a lot less layers of paint and detail than the foreground. Combined with the lack of contrast, it works even better. What's kind of crazy is that this lack of detail, looser painting effect isn't what we ever see in reality, but your brain interprets those as farther away, as if it's a lack of focus. In recent years, I've done this in a lot of paintings, and you can just suggest the general colors and lighting and leave it alone, and magically it sort of works. You can see from the palette that as the painting moves on, I'm bringing in darker colors and mixing with less water. If you get dark too early, it has a tendency to get muddy, especially if you're applying wetter paints on top. Late in the painting, I spent a lot of time working on the olive-sided flycatcher. The bird itself took about 2 hours to paint altogether. Here I'll just hit the highlights. The belly had washes of lemon yellow, working in some glazing of chrome orange, and shading with some ultramarine blue and dioxazine purple. The head had a lot of different colors. My first passes were browns made up of sap green, chrome orange, cadmium red, and dioxazine purple. Later glazes brought in many other colors, including passes of burnt sienna and other desaturated greens and grays. I used mostly a number 2 round brush, but I did crack out the 10-aught brush for fine details around the eye, the beak, feet, wings, and the tail. Getting the area behind the feet and the branch to look right may have taken the longest time on the bird itself. Although they call these olive-sided flycatchers, they're really more of a gray-vested flycatcher. For the gray sides of the bird, I used a lot of dioxazine purple, sap green, and cadmium red, as well as some passes with burnt sienna and ultramarine blue for super dark, almost blacks. With the bird pretty much wrapped up, I finished sharpening up a lot of small details on the branches, especially the exposed sections without lichens and bark. On those, I added some extra darks with some saturated colors, then followed up with a lot of tiny dark details to the lichens for some deep shadows. With that, I thought things were pretty much finished up, and I called it a day. So there you go, a 7x10" transparent watercolor of an olive-sided flycatcher. That was a fun one to paint. Thanks so much for taking the time to watch. I hope you get a chance to paint soon.